You, he finally managed, his voice a mere whisper. But that means... Before he could finish, the door slammed shut behind him, as if an invisible force had sealed the truth within the walls of the store. What had started as a simple confrontation over a misunderstanding was spiraling into something much bigger, much darker. The stakes were higher now, the secrets much deeper, and no one could have predicted how this day would end. The room seemed to close in on itself, the weight of Mrs. Thompson's revelation pressing down on everyone. Mr. Johnson stood there, his mouth still open, trying to process the impossible truth. The store wasn't his after all. He had been managing it, but he wasn't the owner. Mrs. Thompson was. The elderly woman, quiet and humble, had been the silent force behind the scenes this whole time. She looked at him, her gaze firm and unwavering. "You've been running this place like your own, making decisions without my consent, cutting corners, and treating my customers like dirt. You thought I wouldn't find out. That's why you hired this boy here," she said, nodding toward the cashier, who looked like he was about to faint. "You thought he wouldn't notice too, didn't you?" The young man's eyes filled with shame, and his head dropped. The store had always been his job, but now it felt like a trap, a place where he had made choices he couldn't undo. His heart pounded in his chest, and all he could think of was how close he had come to losing everything, his job, his dignity, over a single impulsive act. Mrs. Thompson had seen it all, and somehow it felt like she was the one who had been in control the entire time. But just as it seemed everything was about to implode, the man in the suit, who had been standing quietly, finally spoke up. "Enough," he said sharply, stepping forward. The authority in his voice rang out, and for a brief second, it silenced the room. Mr. Johnson looked at him confused. "What do you mean enough? She's..." The man interrupted, turning his gaze on him. "She's right. You've been exploiting her store for your own gain." He turned to Mrs. Thompson, a slow, almost apologetic smile forming on his lips. "But you should know, Mrs. Thompson, I've been working with you longer than you think." Mrs. Thompson's brow furrowed, the puzzle pieces beginning to fall into place. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice low, but sharp. The man in the suit paused, his eyes meeting hers. "I'm not just your business partner," he said, his words deliberate. "I'm also your son." The room went dead silent. Mr. Johnson's jaw dropped. The young cashier stared, unblinking. Mrs. Thompson's eyes widened, and for a moment she seemed lost in the revelation. The truth was out, and it was more complicated than anyone had expected. The man she had spent years working with, the man who had appeared to be just a distant acquaintance, was her own flesh and blood. Mrs. Thompson blinked slowly, as if trying to absorb what he had said. "You're my son," she whispered, a mixture of disbelief and a strange, quiet recognition in her eyes. All this time, Daniels swallowed hard. His night had just gone from bad to worse. Daniels forced a laugh, but it came out shaky. "Just a misunderstanding," he said quickly. "No need for backup." Ruiz didn't move. His gaze flicked to Tamara, then back to Daniels. Something wasn't adding up, and he could feel it. "Captain," he asked carefully, "is everything all right?" Tamara didn't answer right away. She studied Daniels, watching the sweat bead on his forehead. He was crumbling, his confidence unraveling with every second. Then she took a slow breath and reached into her glove compartment. Daniels tensed, but instead of a weapon, she pulled out a small recording device. The red light was still blinking. Daniels' face turned ghost white. "I knew something was off," Tamara said, holding up the recorder. "So I made sure to document everything." Ruiz took a step closer. "What exactly did you document?" Tamara pressed play. Daniel's own voice filled the air, his threats, his fabricated reason for the stop, even the moment he considered planting evidence. Ruiz's expression darkened. "Daniels, you're done." Daniels took a step back, his eyes darting for an escape, but it was over. Then, just as the weight of his downfall settled, Tamara delivered the final blow. "Internal Affairs has been investigating you for weeks," she said. This just sealed your fate." Daniel's entire body sagged. He had spent years thinking he was untouchable, but in a single night, he had walked right into his own trap. As Ruse placed him in handcuffs, Tamara watched in silence. Justice had finally caught up to him, and now the real work of cleaning up the department could begin. As Daniels was led to the back of the patrol car, Tamara finally let out the breath she'd been holding. The night had been long, but justice had been served. She turned to Ruiz, who shook his head in disbelief. "Guess the department made the right call bringing you in," he said. Tamara gave a small smile. "There's a lot of work to do," she replied, "but this is a start." Word of Daniel's arrest spread quickly. Officers who had once turned a blind eye were now forced to confront the corruption within their ranks. Some stepped forward with their own stories, while others, like Daniel's, scrambled to cover their tracks. But the message was clear: things were changing. As Tamara drove away, she glanced in her rearview mirror. The city lights stretched before her, and for the first time in a long time, she felt hope. This was only the beginning. "You came back," he said softly. Emma didn't waste time. "Who are you?" she demanded. "What's going on? That man in the suit, what does he know about you?" The homeless man sighed, as if the weight of his past had finally caught up to him. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," he said, "but I have no choice now." He looked around, ensuring no one else was nearby, then spoke in a hushed tone. "I was once a powerful man, someone in a position to change things, to help people. But I crossed the wrong people. They made me disappear, erased everything about me, turned me into this." He motioned to his ragged clothes. "They wanted to silence me, so they gave me nothing but this life. I've been living in hiding, waiting for the right moment to make things right. And you've been caught in the middle of it." Emma's head spun. It was all too much. She wanted to believe him, but the pieces didn't fit. "That man in the suit," he continued, "he's one of them. They're watching, waiting. And now that you know, they'll come for you too." Just as Emma opened her mouth to respond, the sound of footsteps approached from behind. Before she could react, the man in the suit stepped into view again, a sinister smile creeping across his face. "You should have stayed out of this, Emma," he said, his voice cold. "Now, you'll never be able to walk away." In a flash, the homeless man stepped forward, pushing Emma aside and standing between her and the stranger. For the first time, his eyes were filled with a fire she hadn't seen before. "I won't let you hurt her," he growled, his voice low and steady. But just as the tension in the air reached its peak, something unexpected happened. The man in the suit paused, his eyes flicking toward the street behind Emma. A car screeched to a halt. Dozens of men in black suits emerged, surrounding them. The homeless man's face went pale. "It's too late," he whispered, his voice breaking. In a sudden, shocking turn, the man in the suit turned on his heels, signaling his team to retreat. "We'll be back for you," he called over his shoulder, before disappearing into the darkness. Emma stood frozen, her mind reeling. What had just happened? The day started like any other at Johnson's Market, a small neighborhood store that had been around for years. But what happened inside would shock everyone. An elderly black woman walked in, just looking to buy a few things. She had been shopping there for ages, always greeted with kindness, until today. The new cashier, a young, impatient employee, didn't recognize her. When a misunderstanding of a payment arose, things escalated fast. The seller, frustrated, raised their voice, then did something unthinkable, striking the elderly woman. Gasps filled the store as customers froze in disbelief. But the real shock came moments later when the store owner walked in and revealed a truth that left the cashier speechless. What happens next will change everything. Who really owns this store? And what will be the consequences of that terrible moment? Stay tuned, because this story is just getting started. As the door chimes rang, the store owner, Mr. Johnson, walked in. His face, usually warm and welcoming, was now tense with disbelief. He had been out for the day, handling some personal matters, But something about the scene in front of him didn't sit right. The elderly woman, now sitting quietly, seemed shaken but composed, while the cashier stood frozen, their face pale with realization. Mr. Johnson turned to the cashier, his eyes narrowing with confusion. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice calm but carrying an edge. The young employee stammered, explaining what had happened, but the words fell flat in the heavy silence. The woman, who had been a loyal customer for years, quietly stood up. Her slow, steady movements revealed an air of quiet strength, but there was something else, something more to her than just the victim of a random incident. As Mr. Johnson looked at her, his expression changed. You're Mrs. Thompson?" he asked, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. The woman nodded. The tension in the room grew, and so did the question.